If you're new here, then welcome. My name is Vortex Thoughts, and I talk about a variety of things but tend to focus on history and media. If you're returning, then welcome back. Regardless of whether you are new to this channel or not, if you like the content you see, please hit that like button, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Things like this help support my channel and help it grow. If you want to see me talk about a topic you think is important, comment it down below or tweet me at Vortex Thoughts. Now, let me start the video. The Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921 is one of the worst tragedies to have ever been done on American soil by other Americans. Arguably, this was the finale to a 3-year-long, racially motivated spree of violence all over the United States in which black people were targeted by their white counterparts in violent riots. This destruction of one of the most financially successful black neighborhoods, one dubbed as the Black Wall Street, one of which, if it had been allowed to grow and prosper, it may have become one of the largest masses of wealth for black Americans for decades to come. If you're not familiar with the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, or otherwise known as the Tulsa Race Riot, don't worry, you're not alone in this. This is something I only found out about a few years ago, and something that for a very long time was hidden under the surface and not talked about at all. This bloody history has been forgotten in mainstream history, and not until recent years, up as recent as 2001, was this massacre even acknowledged or talked about in any official capacity. Not until 2020 was this massacre finally an official part of the Oklahoma school curriculum, while before that, the massacre wasn't required for learning until 2002. This video is an attempt to explain the background of what happened before the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, what the riot was, and what the people of Tulsa have done since, and how they are keeping the memories of those lost alive. I hope it goes without saying, but I will say it again. This video topic deals with some heavy issues. If you do not think you can handle this topic, please do not watch it. There will be mentions of sensitive issues such as death, racism, racially motivated violence, and discrimination. While this video will be edited to fit the guidelines of YouTube, viewer discretion is advised. And lastly, before we move on, I do also want to say that any and all people informed or shown in here are real human beings. Their ancestors hold their memories very dear, and it is not up to us to go and ask them for information, even if they are public figures. Let us remember there are worthy resources out there, both written and spoken by these folks, that you can access if you have more questions. So let's keep their memory alive and keep that level of respect for them. Now, to set the scene, the early 1900s still had many people feeling some type of way after the Civil War ended. It wasn't that long since 1920 since the Civil War happened, maybe 40, 50 years, which might seem like a lot, but it really isn't. Many whites, although no longer emboldened in the same way they had been during the Civil War and prior to when enslavement was legal, still felt some bitterness towards their black counterparts. This was exacerbated by the fact that many black Americans who fought and put their lives on the line during World War I saw the treatment they received back home in America and were upset by that and demanded equal rights. As the South slowly rebuilt itself and made Jim Crow the law of the land, and in case you didn't know, Jim Crow were these sets of laws that separated black people and white people by sheer fact that one set happened to be black and one set happened to be white. This is where those white-only places, water fountains, and sit at the back of the bus type of things came out of, and what the civil rights fought to end. This also led to black people being forced to work menial work, such as sharecroppers, housemates, and other types of work that they would have been doing beforehand, along with only having to live in black-only neighborhoods. There is a lot to be said about the Jim Crow era of the South, and while I can't get into it in this video, just know that these laws were meant to keep black people from garnering any financial, political, or social power whatsoever in the South. It was meant to keep them disenfranchised and poor. This system of laws worked so well that it inspired that one German dude, whose name we don't talk about, and his policies to make Jewish people and those of Jewish descent public enemies in Germany, and even how it even influenced the racial division that was seen in apartheid South Africa until about the end of 1994. That's how vile and disgusting these types of laws were, and they inspired some of the evilest people and evilest groups of people to ever exist in this planet. Prior to this violence, race riots across America had been plenty. It resulted in lynchings of black men, some white men, all accused of assaulting white women, one of which had happened in the year 1920 prior in Tulsa. Although Roy Belton was not accused of assaulting anybody, he was accused of potentially injuring a cab driver so terribly that he would have died had he not been taken to the hospital almost immediately. And as I mentioned, prior to this, about 26 cities in the United States also underwent huge bouts of racially motivated violence. The two biggest of the factors, as I said, are the fierce competition for jobs, urbanization, and the soldiers returning from war, where they realized that the way they were treated here in America wasn't that great, and they did not want to be treated like that, especially since they did put their lives on the line to defend this country and other countries. So how could they be treated as such when they tried and almost gave up their whole lives for it? And while I will not touch on the Red Summer of 1919 that much in this video, it is important to know that this violence, this racially motivated violence against black people, was something that was happening and happening frequently enough that the race riot that happened in Tulsa wasn't that much of an anomaly. It was something that could have happened any other day, any other year within that time frame. What's also important to know is that while Black Wall Street, as that part of Tulsa was known as, was becoming one of the most financially successful neighborhoods to ever exist in America, there was also a rise in the KKK amongst Oklahoma in particular. The KKK's first era ended in 1871 after they attempted and failed to overthrow the government. But the feelings they had, whether that be ignorant racist feelings or quote unquote justified feelings, these types of racists were the type of racists that we see in the KKK, resurged into existing by one movie. And that movie is Birth of a Nation by David Wark Griffith, otherwise known as D.W. Griffith. D.W. Griffith made a whole bunch of other films like The Love Flower, Hearts of a World, Charlie Chaplin's The Funniest Man in the World, and True Heart Susie, just so you know a few. The one he's most known for is Birth of a Nation, which, like I said, resurged the popularity of the KKK. This movie was one of the most technologically advanced movies to have been created at the time. It was even screened at the White House, where President Woodrow Wilson, who happened to be in power at the time, was a big supporter of segregation and Jim Crow laws. A little brief summary of Birth of a Nation is that, for the first time in history of the nation, was told in two parts. The Civil War of the United States, and then Reconstruction of the war. After the war, I mean. This film was also based on the novel The Klansman by Thomas Dixon II, and basically this movie all but made the KKK heroes. It portrayed black men as these aggressive people who could not be trusted anywhere around white women in particular, and to have a black man and a white woman, or a white person really, anywhere near each other would only instigate or provoke the black man into attacking them. Obviously, if you know anything about segregation, you also know that most, if not all, of the films with black people in it weren't actually black people. It was white people in blackface. This film is the reason we think of the KKK the way we do, as sheet-wearing racist monsters whose only goal was to enable white people to remain in power by demonizing and killing black people. This was especially important as black people, post the Civil War, gained their independence. At the time, 1920, 1921, being a member of the KKK to these white Southerners wasn't something to be ashamed of or to hide. It was a source of the highest pride. The film played on a lot of the fears that many of these white Southerners had at the time. The fear of black people stuffing any ballot boxes. I hope that sounds familiar.
What are you doing here today?
We are here to secure the vote, and this is to stop people from voting without IDs in the state of Michigan.
And take political power, while white people were going to be denied the opportunity to vote. And not to mention, it also demonstrated that the Republicans, who, if you guys know anything about history, know that at the time they were the party for liberal ideas, and to demonstrate that these Republicans were going to get more and more radicalized to the point where they would allow black people to control the South and treat the whites the very way they had been treated by them. Even at this time, this movie was considered controversial, and even to this day, like I said, it is Griffith's most widely known work, as this man single-handedly helped push the increased discrimination and racial violence that black people have felt almost immediately since that movie came out and the many decades after. It is said that this movie was so successful at the time that it set box office records to the point where the studios and movie theaters stopped counting all the money that came in because it just kept making more and more money, putting no doubt in my mind how much this movie truly influenced any and all racially motivated attacks after this movie came out. This special swirl of circumstances set the stage for the Tulsa Race Massacre, one of the deadliest race riots in which anywhere from 50 to 300 people died and about 800 people were injured, and with over 6,000 black residents forced into large detainment facilities for several days. Now that the stage has set, let's begin with the massacre. What started the Tulsa Race Massacre? The day was Memorial Day, Monday the 30th of 1921. The then 19-year-old Dick Rowland was a young black man employed as a shoe shiner. He happened to be entering the Drexel building, the only building within any reasonable distance to where he worked that had a coloreds only restroom. He was entering the elevator to use the restroom, and while it is exactly not known what happened, it is known that Rowland most likely tripped while entering the elevator, and in falling, trying to grab anything to prevent his falling, he grabbed 17-year-old Sarah Page's arm, the white teenager operating the elevator that day. Page screamed, which prompted Rowland to flee back to Greenwood. And while it's not known why Rowland fled, it can be accepted that his fear for his life was beyond reasonable. As mentioned earlier, many black men and black boys had been lynched prior to this incident on the grounds of assault against a white woman. His fear was real. To stay could have meant death for him, and so he ran back home. When the scream was heard, a clerk at the Renberg's clothing store on the first floor ran over and saw Rowland running away, and assumed that because Page had screamed and Rowland was running away, that an attempted assault had occurred. This clerk called the police, and the police began a low-profile investigation with both Page and later on Rowland. Page denied any and all allegations of assault and didn't press any charges. However, the police sheriff at the time, newly elected Willard M. McCullough, feared that if this investigation was not handled properly, a manhunt would occur and the lynching of Rowland may happen regardless of whether this assault had happened or not. And so thus, Police Sheriff McCullough continued a low-profile investigation, and after speaking to Miss Page, he sent two officers, Detective Henry Carmichael and Patrolman Henry C. Pack, in the early hours of Tuesday to Greenwood and to arrest Rowland and place him in the Tulsa County Jail. Not entirely sure how the word got out, Rowland was moved to a more secure location after Police Commissioner J.M. Atkinson received a phone call where Rowland's life was threatened. As this was occurring, one of the two main newspapers in Tulsa, one titled the Tulsa Tribune, owned and operated by Richard L. Jones, a sensationalist newspaper, published this inflammatory article titled "Nabbed Negro for Attacking Girl in Elevator," in which Jones claimed that Rowland will be tried in a municipal court this afternoon on a state charge, that the girl Sarah Page said she had noticed Rowland a few minutes before the attempted assault, looking up and down the hallway on the 3rd floor of the Drexel building as if to see if there was anyone in sight, but thought nothing of it at the time. A few minutes later, he entered the elevator, she claimed, and attacked her, scratching her hands and face and tearing her clothes. Her screams brought a clerk from the Renberg store to her assistance, and the man fled. He was captured and identified by the girl and the clerk, police say. In addition to this, it is claimed that by many residents of Tulsa, one primarily made by W.D. Williams, a teacher at the Booker T. Washington High School. In the newspaper as well, along with this previous article mentioned, there was another article called To Lynch a Night. This article resulted in a very understandable fear for safety for Rowland. Whether this second article was ever published or not is a mystery, as any of the original copies of this newspaper have either been ripped out, destroyed, or not turned over in over 100 years. But what I am sure of is that this article, the original one, with 100% certainty did not help the rising tensions of that day. As a result, many white Tulsans went to the courthouse by sunset to demand for Rowland, but were denied by Sheriff McCullough and told to go home. Sheriff McCullough had placed some of his men on the roof, armed them with powerful rifles and shotguns, disabled the only elevator in the building, and placed the rest of his men at the entrance of the staircase, barricaded them, and told them to protect the building. If they were to see anyone, they were to be shot on sight. At approximately 8:20 p.m., Sheriff McCullough was asked by 3 members of the white mob to turn over Rowland, but he refused. As this was happening over at the Tulsa courthouse, there had been small groups of black men, primarily veterans of World War I, arriving at the courthouse to scout for information and to let Greenwood know what was going on with Rowland. Some of the men in the white mob, in seeing black men arrive armed, went home to retrieve their own weapons, and some attempted and failed at taking over the Oklahoma National Guard Armory, which alerted the National Guard of Oklahoma that something dangerous may be occurring. Even Reverend Charles William Kerr from the First Presbyterian Church in Tulsa attempted to defuse the situation, but failed. As the crowd at the courthouse swelled to about 2,000 men at its peak, at about 10 p.m., after all the smaller groups of black men came back with more and more distressing news, a larger group of about 75 armed men decided to go to the courthouse and offer their support. That was ultimately rejected by Sheriff McCullough. What exactly happened next is anyone's best guess, but the most agreed upon conclusion comes from the 2001 Commission report, in which it is stated, as the black men were leaving, a white man attempted to disarm a tall African-American World War I veteran. A struggle ensued and a shot rang out. Then, according to the sheriff, all hell broke loose. At the end of the exchange of gunfire, 12 people were dead, 10 white and 2 black. Another well-known story is told by Eloise Taylor Butler. Reported by her great-granddaughter, Miss Butler is the daughter of the famous, well-known Pegleg Taylor. This is what she stated. In fact, it escalated to the courthouse. It started like down the street from the courthouse. Pegleg Taylor then goes on to say that he saw a group of around 6 white men approach and beat down on lone black men. Then, black store owners came out of nearby the shops to defend the black man, and having to defend him, they had to shoot at the group of white men attacking him. Pegleg also states that while the black store owners fought back the best they could, but the white mob set those initial shops on fire at the very beginning, really unable to do much for themselves or anyone else. While unsure of which of these two accounts occurred exactly, the 2001 committee has believed that what Pegleg Taylor witnessed was the violence that came down from the courthouse down to Archer Street, where the first looting and destruction did occur due to the proximity to the courthouse. What did happen with ultimate certainty is that when the gunfights from the courthouse rolled down to Archer Street and down to Greenwood, utter chaos occurred. There were many black families leaving the Dreamland Theater, one of the most popular establishments on Black Wall Street. As these patrons began to flee the scene, they were shot at indiscriminately by the white mob. It didn't matter, man, woman, or child. If you were black, you were shot. The Oklahoma Historical Society alleges that some of the mob were deputized by the police and by the police chief Gustafson, whose name I can't pronounce, and instructed to go get a gun and get a As mentioned earlier, due to some of the white mob attempting to breach the armory with the National Guard, members of the National Guard began to patrol the streets and round up any and all black residents and took them to the convention hall on Brady Street for detention. The last of the actions of the night was a small crowd of whites going back to the courthouse and demanding for Rowland once again. Demanding for Rowland so they could lynch him, in which they were of course denied, and left without storming the courthouse, presumably to go and destroy more of Greenwood. Throughout the early hours of June 1st, fear and uncertainty reigned supreme. Many armed men of both races engaged in gunfights, and while many more white rioters went into vehicles to shoot at Greenwood and burn and loot any businesses or homes they came across as they gained more ground into Greenwood itself. There was a rumor going around the white rioters that more armed black people were coming on train, and so when any train passed by, they would be shot at, resulting in any trains going right past Tulsa. In addition to the destruction of Black Wall Street, white rioters went to white families who had employed black people as their live-in cooks, maids, servants, etc., and gave them one of two options. 1, to turn over their black employees, or 2, refuse and risk the same type of violence on their family and home that they saw happening to Black Wall Street. As the fires began to blaze intensely by 1 a.m., the crews of the Tulsa Fire Department were turned away from the properties by gunpoint by many of the rioters. Threatened with violence if they were to do anything to preserve the buildings the rioters had set ablaze. It is stated by Scott Ellsworth, author and historian of The Groundbreaking An American City and Its Search for Justice. He states, "It would mean a fireman's life to turn a stream of water onto one of those black-owned businesses. They shot at us all morning when we were trying to do something, but none of my men was hit. There is not a chance in the world to get through that mob in the Negro district." In other words, the buildings, both residential and business, were left to burn to the ground as white rioters wanted the total and complete destruction of Greenwood. There are notions that the KKK co-founder and member W. Tate Brady participated in as a night watchman. Brady claims that he reportedly witnessed 5 dead Negroes, with one being dragged behind an automobile with a rope about his neck throughout the business district. Keep Brady in mind. I will speak about him later in this video. But it goes to show that even if they weren't wearing hoods that night, the Klan was out. At about 5 a.m., the train whistle went off. And keep in mind, this is all on June 1st, so this is the next day. And to many of the white rioters, this was a signal for them to launch an all-out assault on Greenwood. Many of them began delving deeper into Greenwood, emboldened by this signal, and were shot at by snipers. Some got in cars again and tried to do some drive-by shooting, or throwing flame Molotov cocktails basically, to cause more death and destruction. As they got into the residential area of Greenwood, they began to loot and destroy any houses for ill-gotten wealth or weapons to turn against their owners. Another rumor spreading quickly throughout the white rioters was that the new Mount Zion Baptist Church was being used as a fortress and armory, with 20 caskets full of rifles having been delivered to the church. This rumor, however, was neither confirmed by any credible source or task force. Another incident that was frequently spoken about was the use of planes during the riot. While not substantiated, many of the first-hand accounts talk about the use of planes, and the only credible written source, keep in mind written, source of an eyewitness was not discovered until 2015. This book of eyewitness statements was written by Buck Colbert Franklin, in which these are some notable quotations. "Lurid flames roared and belched and licked their forked tongues in the air. Smoke ascended the sky in thick black volumes, and amid it all, the planes, now a dozen or more in number, still hummed and darted here and there with the agility of natural birds of the air. Planes circling in midair, they grew in number and hummed and darted and dipped low. I could hear something like hail falling on top of my office building. Down East Archer, I saw the old Midway Hotel on fire, burning from its top, and then another, and another, and another, and another building began to burn from their top. The sidewalks were literally covered with burning turpentine balls. I knew all too well where they came from, and I knew all too well why every burning building first caught fire from the top. I paused and waited for an opportune time to escape. Where, oh where is our splendid fire department with its half-dozen stations? I asked myself. Is the city in conspiracy with the mob? And while the destruction of Greenwood was happening, at about 9:15 a.m., Adjutant General Charles Barrett arrived with 109 troops of the National Guard of Oklahoma in an attempt to regain control of the city. Due to orders from the governor of Oklahoma, James B.A. Robertson, General Barrett could not legally act until he had contacted and received approval from all local authorities deemed appropriate. These authorities included Tulsa Mayor T.D. Evans, the Tulsa Sheriff McCullough, and the Tulsa Police Chief Gustafson. By 11:49, martial law went into effect, and by noon of June 1st, most if not all of the riot had been suppressed. A few days later, on June 4th, 1921, Field Order No. 7 removed the order of martial law, and by then the efforts and reconstruction had been in full effect. Once the dust settled, the destruction of this riot was unimaginable. By the time that the sun began to rise, Black Wall Street was not recognizable as it had been the night before when the sun set. Over 24 black-owned businesses were burned to the bottom on the street, along with several homes burned, destroyed, and looted, with anywhere of 50 to 300 black Tulsans dead and many, many more injured, and 6,000 of them detained by the National Guard at the convention hall, now known as the Tulsa Theater, the Tulsa County Fairgrounds in McNulty Park. This also left upwards of 10,000 black Tulsans homeless and penniless, as both their homes and way of supporting themselves financially were destroyed beyond recognition. It is important to note that many of these numbers are estimated, as any of the deaths of black victims were not considered by the whites in power at the time to be that important, so any and all numbers of saliency were documented by relief organizations such as the Red Cross or Americans coming in to aid Tulsa outside of Oklahoma, such as the NAACP. So while not documented, these numbers may be more than just those reported. And while we can go on tangents on how many people were or were not killed, we cannot comprehend the magnitude of this assault as much as we think we can. Because as recently as 2021, the numbers of the dead began to change. But I'll talk about this later towards the end of this video. Walter Francis White of the NAACP traveled to Tulsa from New York trying to gauge the damage, and he stated he saw somewhere of 150 graves dug and thousands of dollars in damages. The Red Cross, one of the first aid organizations on site in Tulsa, aided many in healthcare as the Black Hospital had been destroyed. They treated over 500 people with first aid, hospitalized 183, and estimated the death count from anywhere from 55 to 300. Most of the Tulsans that were directly affected by this riot, aka the black people of Tulsa, about 100,000 people in large part depended on the Red Cross in order to survive. The Red Cross provided first aid, healthcare, food, shelter, job training and placement, and legal support for any and all of the survivors. Aides who helped with the Red Cross stated that the people of Greenwood had the characteristics of prisoners of war, having lost everything and then being treated horribly by their own government. Many of the residents of Greenwood lived in tents and other types of non-permanent housing directly donated by the Red Cross as they rebuilt their homes from the ground up. The total loss of property, both commercial and residential, was estimated to be about $1.5 million in business and $750,000 in residential in 1921. And I'll repeat that again just in case you didn't hear me. The total damages in 1921 were estimated to be a total of $2,250,000. And this, in 2021, this would have been equivalent to a total of $34 million in total destruction. In addition to these estimates and efforts by the Red Cross, Governor Robertson called for a grand jury, and with Judge Valjean Biddison, they attempted to quote-unquote figure out what really happened in Tulsa. Judge Biddison subpoenaed over 85 people of both races, and while no one was really convicted of any crime, they attempted to use this as a tool to never let this happen again, but just under the surface with a white-only jury. It was deemed that black people had as much of a reason to have started the race riot as the white people did, thus nobody was charged with any crime. The biggest issue, and the main reason why it took so long to figure out what to do for the many black residents of Tulsa, was the fact that a huge chunk of land was opened up, and something that the white leaders of Tulsa attempted to take full advantage of. Many city planners began to try and rezone the burned areas for industrial use in white businesses, as Archer and parts of Greenwood were now open to construction. And I hope you remembered him, because this is where W. Tate Brady comes back in. As mentioned, Brady was not only a member of the KKK, he was also the co-founder, and he was a KKK member until the day he killed himself.
And I'm not saying she deserved it, but I'm saying God's timing is always right.
And as a result, he was one of those who aggressively pushed for an industrial section. An industrial section which he stated would draw more distinctive lines between whites and blacks, and thereby eliminate the intermingling of the lower elements of the two races. He was stopped by the Supreme Court, but many other factors also went into making this plan a reality. Most, if not all, the black families whose entire lives were destroyed were ignored or denied any monetary compensation from their insurance companies or the government. And if they were given any money at all, it certainly wasn't enough to rebuild what they once had. Anything that was rebuilt was a shadow of its former self, something which can be seen by the way that Greenwood looks in this day and age. And this isn't to say that Greenwood looks terrible now. This is to say that the grand and beautiful way that Tulsa looked before this race riot could not be replicated, because how can you replicate it when you aren't given the tools or resources or goddamn support to rebuild it back to what it was? It couldn't happen. Many of these families who were victims of this massacre spent the winter of 1921 and 1922 in tents as they attempted to rebuild, to only meet even more roadblocks. A group of wealthy and influential white developers persuaded the city to pass a fire ordinance that would essentially make it illegal to build a house frame out of wood to prevent another tragedy. In addition to this, Wills, the Red Cross regional director, expressed anger at city officials with this fire ordinance, and later with the dissolution of the Public Welfare Committee to the Reconstruction Committee, which all in all did nothing at all to help the people of Tulsa. The new fire ordinance was eventually litigated and appealed in the Oklahoma Supreme Court, where it was deemed unconstitutional and the original ordinance remained, thus allowing rebuilding to continue. However, despite all of what the Red Cross did, along with the NAACP, the original layout of Black Wall Street was permanently altered. The construction of the Coast End building and the Union Depot, a larger train hub that had been previously started a few blocks south of this one, were overseen and built by the Manhattan Construction Company based out of Tulsa. This Union Depot was built in less than 2 years after the riot, and thus demonstrating just how little those in power truly cared about their black residents. And in a way, we're honoring what the racist groups such as the KKK really wanted out of Tulsa. One of the few goodish things that came out immediately after the riot was allegations of corruption in the police force, and as a result, Chief Police John A. Gustafson, I can't say his name, I'm going to struggle with that one, being the subject of an investigation starting on June 6th of that same year. He was prosecuted on multiple counts, and the charges were refusing to enforce prohibition, refusing to enforce anti laws, allowing known automobile thieves to escape justice for the purpose of extorting the citizens of Tulsa for rewards relating to their return, repurposing vehicles for his own use or sale, operating a fake detective agencies for the purpose of billing the city of Tulsa for investigative duties that he was already being paid for as chief of police, failing to enforce gun laws, and failure to take actions during the riots. Gustafson was found of being guilty of fraud before he was even an officer in the Tulsa Police Department. So get this. This dude, along with his previous partner, Phil Kirk, had been convicted of using blackmail, in which all the letters they had been sent from their agency office to the members of the community. One of the letters, which was the blackmailing of a father who had assaulted his own 11-year-old daughter, who had since become pregnant. So we had a police chief with a criminal record. On July 30th of 1921, Gustafson was found guilty of 2 counts: negligence for failing to stop the riot, which resulted in his dismissal from the police force, and conspiracy for freeing these car thieves and collecting rewards, which resulted in a jail sentence. As a result of everything, due to the previous tensions of the time and age, along with the violent riot and the inhumane ways in which these black families were treated, this riot went unheard. It was thought of as best forgotten. Many black families just wanted to move past it and not dwell on the past, while any city officials wanted it swept under the rug. That is signified by the fact that aside from Gustafson, no one else was charged for any of the violence and destruction that happened in the riot. And even the police chief's charges had to do more with inaction rather than direct action. The only person that dared speak on this race riot was Mary E. Jones Parrish, who gathered any and all first-hand accounts that she could and wrote a book and published it as The Events of the Tulsa Disaster. This tragedy was not taught or even acknowledged in official channels until the early 70s. The Tulsa Chamber of Commerce attempted to commemorate the riot until they saw the accounts and photos gathered by Ed Wheeler and denied to publish anything. 2 major newspapers refused to publish it as well, and it was finally published as The Profile of a Race Riot in a newspaper that was only read by black audiences and thus ignored by white America. In the 70s, Henry C. Whitlow Jr., a history teacher at Booker T. Washington High School, along with Mozella Franklin Jones and Ruth Sigler Avery, all collaborated to publicize accounts of the riots. However, both Jones and Avery received pushback and were pressured, especially among whites, to keep silent about the race riot, and as such, their efforts weren't making that much noise. However, while not acknowledged in mainstream white America, there are a plethora of first-hand accounts passed down from one generation to another within the black families directly affected by this race riot. There are 9 stories that are the most well-known, and these include accounts from Dr. Olivia Hooker, Eldoris McCondishi, George Monroe, Leslie Benningfield, aka Mother Randall, Hal Singer, yes, the Hal Singer, Essie Lee Johnson Beck, Vernice Sims, Lena Eloise Taylor Butler, and of course, the already mentioned Miss Mary E. Jones Parrish. Hooker, McCondishi, Monroe, Benningfield, Singer, and Beck were all incredibly young when the race riot happened, while the others weren't as young. And while many of the younger folks at the time don't have very clear memories of what happened, the main thing that they remember and that is shared is the fear, and that is shared with the other 3 well-known survivors, Parrish, Sims, and Butler, who all remember the same amount of fear. Parrish, Sims, and Butler have much clearer memories and have been some of the strongest voices in helping reconstruct what happened and recording first-hand accounts and any eyewitness statements at the time in which it would have gone ignored otherwise. So Dr. Olivia Hooker states that at the time of the riot, she was about 6 years old and remembers that her mother and her 4 siblings were hidden under the dining room table, covered with a tablecloth, in order to remain hidden. Hooker's family lost everything, both their home and their father's business, and relocated to Topeka, Kansas, where she recounts her mother telling her, "Don't spend your time agonizing over the past. Olivia went on to earn many degrees, a master's in psychology from the Teachers College of Columbia University and a doctor in clinical psychology from the University of Rochester. She worked many jobs with her education, but based the majority of her work as an adult on the Tulsa Race Massacre. She passed away on November 21st, 2018, at the age of 103. Mikandishi was about 4 years old when she and her family arrived in Tulsa, and was about 9 years old when the riot began. Mikandishi was one of the eyewitness accounts that stated that she remembered hearing planes raining down bullets, and that many of the women would be fleeing Tulsa were walking along the railroad tracks in their nightgowns and barefoot, as many of them had not had the time to even change their clothing before the violence broke out. Eldoris' family remained in Pachuca, Oklahoma for about 2 to 3 days after fleeing, hiding in a chicken coop and a farmer's kindness hiding them out while the bullets rained down, before they knew it would be safe to return home. When they returned, she stated that the place looked war-torn, with so much of Greenwood burnt to the ground. Her family rebuilt their lives in Tulsa, and Miss Kondishi herself stayed in Tulsa until her death on September the 12th in 2010. George Monroe was about 5 years old when the attack on Greenwood happened. Monroe states that he remembers seeing people get shot, and even has a memory of his own curtains being set on fire by the white mob. The most intense memory he has of the riot was when he and his sister hid under a bed, and when a rioter stepped on one of his fingers, his sister quickly placed her hand over his mouth to keep their presence a secret. Monroe remained in Tulsa until his death in 2001. He became a very successful musician, owned a nightclub, and was the first black man in Tulsa to sell Coca-Cola. Mother Randall, otherwise known as Leslie Benningfield, who is still with us, was a young child when the massacre occurred. She says that while her memories are few, she distinctly remembers the fear she felt and a mob of white men destroying her house. Benningfield is one of the families and the victims in an active lawsuit asking for justice for the victims and families of the race riot. One of the most famous of all the survivors was Mr. Hal Singer, who became an influential figure in jazz and a great musician later in life. Singer states that while the riot was happening, he was about 18 months old, or a year and a half. The reason he and his family survived was due to the kindness of the white woman for who his mother worked for. This woman put the family on a train to Kansas City and ensured their safety, something that up to the day where he passed, on August 18th of 2020, he was eternally grateful for. Singer's family returned to Tulsa once it was safe to do so and rebuilt their whole lives all over again. Singer's career began as a young child, where he spent a lot of time by the rail tracks, where he invited a lot of the jazz bands to come and eat his mother's cooking. This helped him in becoming one of the most iconic saxophonists of his generation. Essie Lee Johnson Beck, who was 5 years old at the time of the massacre, remembers her parents not allowing her or her siblings to go near any windows, as anyone would be shot if they popped out their heads. Her family eventually had to flee their home, as the homes in her neighborhood were being burned. As Beck and her siblings and her mother were trying to get to the Golden Gate Park, she states that she saw airplanes dropping bombs onto the roofs of the houses, causing those wildfires that went unchecked throughout the whole night. Her home was one of the ones that were burnt to the ground and had to live in a tent waiting for their homes to rebuild. She has since passed in 2006. As I mentioned earlier, Miss Parrish was one of the few who dared to speak out about this massacre, as ignoring and forgetting was not good enough for her. She passed away in 1972, but her memory still lives on. As of 2021, her original book was reprinted as The Nation Must Awake, My Witness to the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, which included an afterword by her great-granddaughter, Annalise M. Bruner. The importance of this book, both at the time when it was published and as it continues to be read, is beyond words of how important it is. Vernice Sims happened to be 17 when the massacre took place. She was in her backyard getting ready for her prom when the bullets began to rain down, and she hid in her house. Her family were able to hide in a white family's home when staying in their own home proved too dangerous. When she and her family were finally able to return to their home, their house was gone and thus had to live in a tent. She remembers that Booker T. Washington High School, the one that she had attended prior to the riot, became a makeshift hospital where she volunteered to help the wounded by helping feed them and give them water. She was able to finish high school in Oklahoma City, and after she finished her studies in the Langston University, she finally saw her home rebuilt. Sims recalls that neither the insurance company nor the government gave her family any money to rebuild their home. Last but certainly not least is the accounts of Lena Eloise Taylor Butler, the daughter of the famed Peg Leg Taylor. Many of Butler's accounts were not talked about until 1997, when she finally told her great-granddaughters about her experiences. Taylor's first-hand accounts are those told to her by her father, which are mentioned above, and have to do with how the riot began, in which the fights began on Archer Street and escalated into the mob of the people at the courthouse. Butler also tells of how Pegleg Taylor, her father, fought his way to her and helped her escape. Taylor says that he saw white rioters shooting anyone on sight with no discrimination to age or gender, and would only get up and run until her father had hurt her into moving. Pegleg and Lena eventually made it into a nearby town where they got help, got warm, got clothes, got food, and moved on. And where they also decided that they would never talk about this again. Lena has since died at the age of 98 in the year 2000. Before I move on, I would like to show you the words from the oldest known survivor, Miss Viola Fletcher. She, along with Leslie Evelyn Beveningfield Randall and Hughes Van Elzer, are the oldest survivors of this tragedy. I will leave you with Miss Fletcher's words as she testified before Congress about her experience.
I'm a survivor of the Tulsa Race Massacre. 2 weeks ago, I celebrated my 107th birthday. Today, I'm visiting Washington, D.C. for the first time in my life. I'm here seeking justice, and I'm asking my country to acknowledge what happened in Tulsa in 1921. The night of the massacre, I was awakened by my family. My parents and 5 siblings were there. I was told we had to leave, and that was it. I will never forget the violence of the white mob when we left our home. I still see black men being shot, black bodies lying in the street. I still smell smoke and see fire. I still see black businesses being burned. I still hear airplanes flying overhead. I hear the screams. I have lived through the massacre every day. Our country may forget this history, but I cannot. I will not, and other survivors do not, and our descendants do not. When my family was forced to leave Tulsa, I lost my chance of an education. I never finished school past the 4th grade. I have never made much money in my country. State and city took a lot from me. Despite this, I spent time supporting the war effort in the shipyards of California, but most of my life I was a domestic worker serving white families. I never made much money, but to this day I can barely afford my everyday needs. I'm asking that my country acknowledge what has been happened to me, the traumas and the pain, the loss, and I ask survivors and descendants to be given the chance to seek justice, open the door. For 70 years, the city of Tulsa and its stream of commerce told us that the massacre didn't happen, like we didn't see it with our own eyes. You have me here right now. You see Mother Randall, you see my brother Hughes Van Ellis. We live this history, and we can't ignore it. We lost everything that day, our homes, our churches, our newspapers, our theaters, our lives. Greenwood represented all the best of what was possible for black people in America and for all the people. No one cared about us for almost 100 years. We and our history have been forgotten, washed away. This Congress must recognize us and our history for black America, for the white Americans, and for all Americans.
In 1996, on the 75th anniversary of the massacre, the state legislature of Oklahoma created the commission to investigate the Tulsa Race Riot. The commission was eventually named the Tulsa Race Massacre Commission and was responsible for gathering any and all information of the riot, and this included official documentation, eyewitness accounts, newspapers of the time, any orally told historical events, and researching into various rumors such as the airplanes and the mass graves, as I mentioned before. The Race Massacre Commission found both evidence of a mass grave and use of airplanes inconclusive, although they did acknowledge that it is still a possibility, as the information had either been destroyed by people with high political power or have yet to found any evidence, as even the book written by Colbert wasn't found until 2015. Their final report, submitted on February 28th of 2001, was titled The Tulsa Race Riot, a report by the Oklahoma Commission to study the Tulsa Race Riot of 1921. The report came to a list of priorities for restitution that are to be done to acknowledge and learn and grow from this tragedy. These suggested forms of restitution are as follows below. 1. Direct payment of reparations to the survivors of the 1921 Tulsa Race Riot. 2. Direct payment of reparations to the descendants of the survivors of the Tulsa Race Riot. 3. A scholarship fund available to the students affected by the Tulsa Race Riot. 4. An establishment of an economic development enterprise zone in the historic area of the Greenwood district. And 5. A memorial for the reburial of the remains of the victims of the Tulsa Race Riot. If you wish to read this report, it's available on the internet and will also be linked below. The report is about 200 pages long, and it is quite the read, but I really recommend it. The language is a little tough to get through, but some of those who directly helped create this report themselves were told of this history long before they even dreamed of it being acknowledged officially. And I feel it's important for us to read these things and never forget about them, as the more we don't talk about it, the more it's lost over time. And so, to move on, something that I really didn't touch upon before now were the rumors of the large mass graves of all the black Tulsans buried after the massacre. This rumor is something that went unacknowledged for a long time, and like I said, it being a rumor, they tried and failed to find any evidence that would conclusively either disprove or prove this rumor to be true. Even when the commission who investigated the race riot found the evidence unconclusive and used some non-invasive ground surveys at the three possible locations, being the New Block Park, Oakland Cemetery, and the Booker T. Washington Cemetery, they really didn't do anything beyond that. But this all changed in 2020. On October 21st, 2020, after a forensic team from the Oregon University, I believe, were allowed to do their preliminary forensicness that they need to do by the current mayor at the time. They unearthed 11 coffins in the Oakland Cemetery, and records and research suggested that there may be up to 18 victims buried there. Up until the June of 2021, the team recovered about 35 coffins, and the remains of 19 people were taken to an on-site science lab. Many of these bodies had bullet holes in them, and many had trauma associated with what happened to black people during this massacre. Deneen L. Brown from the Washington Post states, or rather quotes, state archaeologist Carrie Stackleback as saying that this phase of the excavation is now complete. Stackleback said no grave markers existed at the site and no records indicated that the bodies had been buried there. Brown also stated that the remains were initially found in October when authorities were excavating the black section of the Oakland Cemetery as part of the investigation into a search for mass graves that may be connected to the Tulsa Race Massacre. There have not been any new updates at the time of researching this video, but it goes to prove that some of the long-stated rumors by the black families and their surviving relatives have some basis in reality, and gives us hope that we may still be able to learn more about this horrendous tragedy and hopefully give closure to these families and prove without a shred of doubt that the people who were responsible for this went unpunished, and maybe do something so now in the year 2022 nothing like this ever happens again. Black Wall Street in recent years is physically a shadow of its former self, but that isn't to say the spirit is forgotten. While some of the homes and businesses were not rebuilt, their memories aren't forgotten. Like I mentioned earlier, since 2002, schools have been teaching the Tulsa Race Massacre in schools and ensuring this history is not forgotten over time. And as of 2020, it is now a mandatory part of the school curriculum. Many of the survivors and their living relatives have been able to speak out and talk about this time period openly, one which was not possible before. In Greenwood itself, there's now a cultural center that acknowledges this rich and tragic history, and there is artwork, a mural artwork dedicated to this wonderful community. The history of Greenwood is used as a tangible goal for many other black communities in the United States. Proof that if you dream it and you work hard enough, anything can be achieved. And to the brave survivors who have since spoken out and kept this alive, it will not be forgotten, nor will your suffering have been in vain. If we look around, we can see how your spirit, the spirit of Greenwood, is still alive. Black-owned businesses are thriving now more than ever, and I can only hope that we can somehow rebuild this. To conclude this video, I wanted to give some of my thoughts on this issue, and most importantly, what it means that this topic is something that went largely ignored for so long. I don't think what started this riot, whether that be black business owners defending another black man, or a struggle for a weapon, are what matters most. They matter, but what I think needs to be highlighted is the fact that Tulsa, Oklahoma, there was a community of black people not only living, but thriving. They were financially successful enough to rival other wealthy towns in America. And not just that, rival wealthy white towns in America during Jim Crow. And I think this led to a rise of ignorant jealousy. We're talking about a Jim Crow state, one in which black people by law and by culture were seen as less than the white man. We're also talking about a time and place where the KKK was more popular than ever. So then how could a black man be able to thrive in a way that rivaled, if not surpassed the white man? Like John and Lula Williams, the owners of the Williams Dreamland Theater, whose wealth began to look like some of the greats like Chase or Rockefeller, who if the riot had not destroyed everything, would have had generational wealth beyond what some of those little middle-class white Tulsans could have dreamt of at the time. I think this jealousy, along with the fear of black Americans demanding for equal rights after coming back from the war, along with this rise in racist groups like the KKK, led to this perfect powder keg of racial violence. This massacre and the result of it was of white people forcibly pushing black people back down to where they belonged, or what they felt where they belonged, and that of revenge to remind black people that they, no matter how well they did, they would never be the same. And I guess, what can we do with this knowledge? Is acknowledge just how these systems of power can create damage for those who are vulnerable to them, whether that vulnerability is due to racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and any other way that a group in power can sow fear and violence. What can you do personally about it? Well, educate yourself on topics and issues that you may not know a lot about, and keep an open mind about it. Support local businesses. Support businesses that are owned by people of color. Ask yourself the hard questions. And lastly, I'll leave you with this quote from George Santayana to mull over as you think about this topic. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And I think us having forgotten the Tulsa Race Massacre, nearly 100 years after this massacre happened, another one happened. Maybe not to the same extent, but the same type of rhetoric is still being used to this day. So hey y'all, I wanted to thank you guys for sticking through this video. I mentioned it in this video, but I only recently heard about Black Wall Street a few years back and the violent way in which it was destroyed, and I wanted to share it with you guys. If you like this video, do all the things like, subscribe, comment, share, notifications on. It really helps my channel. If you like the art on this channel, reach out to my friend Pink Enigma at pinkenigmaart@gmail.com or via Instagram at pinkenigmaart for commissions. All the links will be down below. She is one of the most talented artists I've worked with and has done big projects for Tales of a Gas Station and so many more, and Snake's Paw, to name a few. If you have any questions about my sources, they are posted below, along with some of the videos that touch some extra videos, that touch on the Tulsa Race Massacre and some of the tensions prior to the Tulsa Race Massacre. Thank you and see you guys next time.